Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Is this working? It's great to see you here, and thanks for joining us. My name is Mark Nelson. I'm Senior Director at the for International Media Assistance here at the National Endowment for Democracy. We're here for a panel discussion that we called Strengthening Freedom of Expression in a Multicultural World. For those of you who are tweeting, I would urge you to use the hashtag SEMA events, which you can also find written in your program. And I'm hoping we'll get some interaction with people who are online because this is being live streamed. And we'd like to hear from people out there who are watching us. We're really thrilled to have this panel with us, and we're going to introduce them to you as we go along. I wanted to mention that one of our panelists got stuck yesterday at O'Hare Airport in a terrible storm, and Gary Young from The Guardian, who is not unfortunately with us, and it's too bad because we had a really great preparatory meeting with him. He sat there waiting to take off for 4 hours yesterday and never got to take off, and then there were no flights that could get him here in time for this. So we're going to miss one of the people that we wanted to have here. But I just wanted to mention a few words about why SEMA really cares about this topic and why we're hosting this event with the Media Diversity Institute, which is one of the leaders in this field. We're living, as you all know, in a global context where local issues, really sometimes really small disputes and things, quickly very global. Digital media is taking these things at the speed of light around the world, and no country, developed or undeveloped, is escaping this instantaneous reach of the media, and its ability to amplify and make things bigger than sometimes they might otherwise have been. Hate speech, incitement to violence, and exaggerated or false news events, whether it's in Ferguson, Missouri, or in northern Nigeria, or a small island in Indonesia, these things can become really major and important events for all of us. And it's happening in all countries. We're also living in a time when a lot of traditional values about women, about sexual minorities, and religious beliefs are changing at a much faster pace than they ever have in previous generations. This pace of change can be highly disorienting for some people, and when these issues are blown up and exaggerated or distorted by the media or used to incite passions, it can lead to conflict and the kinds of disputes that impede the economic and democratic progress that we're all hoping to support. So for the people who are here in this room, many of whom are engaged in helping partners in the developing world build stronger, sustainable media systems, understanding how to manage this kind of issue and these issues is really critical. If we want to help build a world where freedom of expression is protected and defended, we also have to create a world where tolerance and diversity are core values of our societies. And as we've seen in recent events, even some highly developed countries have not really reached a consensus on these things. How should we deal with these issues? We saw in this country major newspapers having very diverse and different opinions about how to treat these events. So that's why we're here today. We're going to use this as a learning opportunity, and I hope we'll come away with some sense of how we can confront these issues and talk about them more openly and in a way that helps us move forward in managing it. And as I said, we couldn't have a better partner in this than the Media Diversity Institute, and I want to introduce and turn the podium over to Rob Levitt, who is the Media Diversity Institute's U.S. board member, who's going to say a few words on behalf of MDI.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, SEMA. We are very pleased to be co-sponsoring this important event. I will just say a very quick word about Media Diversity Institute. We have been working on the kinds of issues that Mark introduced today since the late 1990s around the world in areas of conflict, areas of tension, areas where diversity is fraught with concern with potential violence, and dedicated to working with journalists, with minority communities, with governments, with schools, with other partners like the organizations in this room to build more inclusive journalism, to use the power of media to help build tolerance and understanding across diverse societies. So again, we're very pleased to be here. As Mark mentioned, I am on the US board. We've been based in London since the late 1990s, but flew out of work at New York University in the mid to late 90s, where I first met Milica, you'll meet in a minute. And so we're excited to be again expanding our presence in the United States in the months and years to come, to begin to connect some of the international work we've been doing to the kinds of discussions and debates and organizations in the US, where of course there is a very rich dialogue and set of initiatives around these same concerns. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Razia Iqbal. Many of you know Razia. She's the anchor of BBC NewsHour, the main international program. Has tremendous experience over the last 20 plus years working with the BBC as a foreign correspondent, as an anchor, working in many areas of conflict. And so we really could have no better moderator to really lead and moderate this discussion than Razia.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm not sure that this is working. Can you hear me? I did turn it on, yeah. Is it working? Okay, good. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for coming. On behalf of Seema and I'm delighted to be here. This is a really important subject. And welcome also to all those people who have joined us online. Let me introduce the panel first, and then I'll just say a very short thing, and then we'll open the discussion. So to my left is Milica Pesic, who is from the Media Diversity Institute. All of you, when you came in, got hope. So these are unbelievably experienced people and experts in their field. I'm not going to read the entire paragraphs out. Next to her is Dr. Courtney Radash. Have I mispronounced your names? Raj. From the Committee to Protect Journalists. And to her left is Dr. Viritsa Rupar, who is flown all the way from Auckland in New Zealand. And we are delighted that you so we're here to discuss the issue of freedom of expression, and specifically, as Mark and both Rob said, the notion of strengthening this right in a multicultural world. And we'll talk about the issue, but also what I want to do before the end of the debate is look very practically at ways in which it's possible for you as practitioners, as people who are training journalists, practical ways in which you might feel that you can do that, ways in which you can strengthen the right to freedom of expression. And this debate comes, of course, as we all know, in the wake of the horrific murder of journalists at Charlie Hebdo magazine in Paris on January of this year. I was presenting NewsHour on the morning that happened, and we then rolled with the program. It's normally an hour long, the program. We rolled for 3 hours in an attempt to try and get a handle on what was happening. I want to start by getting each of the panelists to consider this question, because the debate immediately after the murder of those journalists shifted very quickly from anger and being appalled that journalists going into their place of work could be murdered, to very quickly a much more polarized debate, looking at whether or not Charlie Hebdo, as a satirical magazine in the French firmament, was a magazine that should be defended. What was its stance on the depiction of Muslims, the depiction of Jews, of Christians, etc., etc. So there emerged a debate which I think, in a way, gives us the framework for our discussion today. So I want to start by asking each of the panelists to speak for a short time and try and think about the question that I'm going to ask you within the context of Charlie Hebdo, I think specifically, and then we can move on to lots of other examples, many other examples. Do you think that freedom of expression is sacred, or is it contingent on particular contexts in particular countries? Milica.
I think I could say both. It is sacred, but it has to be limited in certain situations. And it really depends whether we are talking about one or the other profession or one or the other media. One thing is if we are talking about artistic films or theater, and which are media too, or we are talking about journalism. In good journalism, there should be some limits, having in mind what is the role of good journalism, to be a watchdog on one side and the other, on the other, to serve the communities, to show some kind of responsibility towards communities. So there should be some limits, and we can talk about, what limits when we talk about journalism.
Right. Courtney.
Is this on? Yes? No? Do I need to do something?
The top.
Oh, here. Okay, sorry. Better? Okay. So I think that the question is not whether it's sacred or there should be limits, but rather the way that I see it is that freedom of expression is the right that underpins and enables so many other rights. And that freedom of expression is a standalone ideal, but it is part of this enabling environment for the enjoyment of other human rights. And so freedom of expression also depends on other rights, like the right to privacy. Oftentimes those things are put into juxtaposition, but in fact, they're two sides of the same coins that enable each other. The freedom of gender identity, to express one's gender identity, is a form of freedom of expression. The freedom to express one's religion, in my opinion, is a form of freedom of expression. So, I really do think that it is a fundamental right that underpins all others. But I also think it's problematic to incorporate everything under something called freedom of expression. So this idea that calling out fire in a crowded room like this is somehow freedom of expression, I think those are different things. I think when we talk about freedom of expression, when we talk about press freedom as a specific dimension of that, we're talking about we're talking about journalism as a specific type of expression, which is, characterized by a certain set of attributes, like being fact-based, like being accurate. It can still be opinionated. It could still be in the form of a drawing. And I think that one thing about Charlie Hebdo is, it was a fringe magazine. And the great thing about multicultural societies where there is broad freedom of expression is that those forms of expression that are offensive to majorities or minorities or can be sidelined. People can choose by them not to hear them. And in fact, we see in more restricted societies where there isn't as much freedom of expression, are restrictions on certain types of journalism or certain types of issues, that there can be greater conflict there, and there isn't necessarily that ability to sideline the fringe content. But I think it's problematic to make Charlie Hebdo seem as if it's Le Monde. So I guess I would leave it at that.
Okay, well, there's an awful lot in what you've said, and we will attempt to unpack some of it. Veritza, what do you think about that particular question?
When I think about that particular question, I think about the situation, and that was when it happened. I brought the case study to my class. Students, what did they think? And all the issues emerged immediately, and current students, they are immediately online and checking the things. And one of them have digged the cover pages of Charlie Hebdo in the past, and how many of them were provoking questions of religion in terms of Christianity, and how many of them in terms of Islam. And we had a wonderful, longer than an hour discussion around that. But to answer your question, thanks for clarity that we are talking about rights here. I think that it is contagious, and it is in all areas of social life, from everyday chat, from everyday conversations. We know that what we say to our friend when it comes to the most sensitive issue of her or his life, we have to also what happens at that individual level of a very small individual dialogue with the best friend is happening at the wider stage as well, talking about politics, talking about media, anything in our lives. When I think about that, of course, there are varieties across the world. It depends on political context, it depends on legal framework, depends on cultural context of the. So it's a complex issue, of course. But if I have to decide, is it sacred? Or there are universal principles, and freedoms are universal. But they are contagious. It is contagious for me.
So let's look at this issue of social responsibility then in the context of Charlie Hebdo, because Melissa, you specifically social responsibility on the part of journalists. Why is it that journalists should have any notion of social responsibility in any case? I mean, I'm surprised to hear you say that there is a social responsibility, because if you are part of the fourth estate, it's your job to question. It is your job to obviously work within a legal framework, and we can talk, that it is contingent on maintaining the rule of law. We have laws of libel in every country, laws of defamation. So journalists are careful not to step over those lines. So why is social responsibility when it comes to journalism and its relationship with freedom of expression important?
First of all, as a fundamental human right, freedom of expression should be enjoyed by all citizens, regardless of their race, ethnicity, gender, age, physical, mental abilities, sexual orientation. And this right could be enjoyed in many ways, through different ways. As a citizen, you can say whatever you like, in a way, through whichever means you want to do it, even, under the fake name. But it's the role of media, meaning journalism, role of journalism to give the voice to these citizens, or to be the watchdog on behalf of these citizens. So if you are doing the watchdog role, you are doing it on behalf of someone, and that someone, we in MDI believe, should be the citizens. So if I'm watching you, what you're doing, I'm supposed to report to those on whose behalf I'm doing it. And that's kind of responsibility I see. If we are going to talk a bit more about Charlie Hebdo, I would say that there is a huge difference to what we've seen in MDI between what happened, for instance, with the Danish cartoons and Charlie Hebdo.
So this is the Danish newspaper which published
some 10 years ago,
Yeah.
probably, and when these issues were first time raised. I think in case of Danish cartoons and Julius Posten, they really wanted to see, to open debate on the boundaries, how far we'll go. And unlike America, Europe is much more into legal framing of certain issues. If I understand well, the things are based on the First Amendment. In Europe, we have a lot of regulations and laws coming from the EU level. So for me, Charlie, as Courtney mentioned, it was a small satirical magazine, which was even not very much respected by French intellectuals. So they really wanted to provoke. And it's like when the American priest wanted to burn the Quran, before the media paid attention to what he wanted to do, he had 5 followers. After he threatened to burn Quran, and all media around the world reported on that. He has apparently now more than 100,000 followers. So this is where the responsibility again comes. Do I report on, and then how I decide. Report, and then we are then moving probably to.
So let me press you a bit more then. So would you argue then that the editors and the journalists at Charlie Hebdo were wrong to publish those cartoons? that they were irresponsible in the context of what you've just said?
Well, taking into consideration the importance of that magazine, or shall I say unimportant magazine, they could have probably gone, because they had such a small audience and a very specific audience. But if you ask me, should Le Monde publish that, I would say probably not, because they have much bigger responsibility.
But many newspapers republished those cartoons, and many chose not to. Many editors chose not to. And I suppose it's about, it goes to the heart of the issue. Is it their right to publish the cartoons? Do they have the right to do it? I mean, you diminish Charlie Hebdo, I think,
in a way,
because I think that it's a magazine that sits in a very long tradition in France of being part of the radical left, and of course they did have a very small circulation. However, their targets were not just Muslims. Never had been.
No.
Their biggest target was the Front
yeah.
National and Le Pen and the Le Pen family and the Pope and Jews and Christians and so on. So this was a magazine that came out of the 1960s kind of radical left tradition. And what I think is really interesting, and perhaps we ought to talk about it, the men who walked into that office that morning and shot those journalists dead didn't attack right-wing magazines in France, which have consistently vilified Arabs, vilified immigrants, vilified Muslims. They didn't go into the offices of France Minute or Valeurs Actuelles. They went into Charlie Hebdo, the very magazine that actually, from a traditional ideological way, would have supported those two men. Courtney.
So I think that it's really important here that we get away from this idea that somehow the content of whether it's Yale's Postin or Charlie Hebdo, that the content caused the action. The whole point, I mean, if you look at 2005, there were months in between the publication and the outrage because there was foment, by, people in specific use that for their own political ends. And I think that if you actually talk to a lot of people, I was a journalist in the Middle East and did my doctoral research there. And I remember I was there in Egypt in 2006, and everyone had an opinion about those 2005 cartoons, and I didn't meet a single person who had ever seen it. So whether newspapers have a right to publish it, certainly they have a right, and depending on your individual editorial decision, you may decide it is newsworthy for people to actually see what the entire world is up in arms against. But you also might decide it's not worth the security risk to our staff who are stationed around the world, so we're not going to publish it. That has to lie with the individual outlet or with the individual, the citizen journalist reposting. And I think that you see, this again being used as such an excuse by countries all around the world as an excuse to clamp down on legitimate speech, on dissent. The Committee to Protect Journalists, we just report on cartoonists under threat around the world. And if you look at it, yes, some of those cartoonists under threat, including a woman who created the Let's All Draw Mohammed Day on Facebook, is actually in hiding in the US. But around the world, we see that political cartoonists who criticize those in authority, who criticize the leaders, for example, Zunar in Malaysia, are facing up to 40 years in prison and in even a death sentence. And we saw in the reaction against Charlie Hebdo from Senegal to Egypt to Gabon that there was this reaction of, let's use this as an excuse to clamp down on the internet, to close critical publications, to imprison journalists. And so I think we have to be very careful, and I would definitely in no way equate the burning of the Quran as an act of instigation with by Charlie Hebdo of, as you mentioned, its ongoing editorial stance of criticizing religion and essentially being wholly secular. I don't think we can equate those, but I think Melissa made a good point, which is the media can choose whether or not something is a story. And so if we get to this issue of multiculturalism and peace building and conflict, the media can decide, and they did with the second, what was his name? Terry, the guy who burned the Quran?
Yeah.
Anyway, so the second time that he did it, the media actually decided, you know what, this is not a story. We're making this a story.
Yeah,
It's not newsworthy in and of itself. And so it wasn't, and it didn't really get any coverage. And so that's where the responsibility lies. Every day, journalists decide what is and what is not newsworthy. And we're actually talking about this in the hallway about Al Jazeera's enormous budget and how they sent a reporter to cover the opening of the Freedom Museum in Birmingham, or something around about the Freedom March and the movement down there. They sent a reporter for a week to do a whole series of stories. And I think that most of the networks, the US networks, gave it 30 seconds and used wire copy. So that's a decision that any news organization can make. Like, let's go deep into this issue of, the implications of slavery. We've got all the repercussions of Ferguson and Baltimore, and let's delve into this. Or they can decide to use 30 seconds of wire copy.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Immediately after the murders of the journalists in Paris, newspapers around the world had the choice to republish the original cartoons which offended, or not to. And the Guardian newspaper decided not to. And I think they had a thumbprint picture, but they were nervous of saying, well, actually, we're going to remind people of the context. But you can remind people of the context without republishing. I wonder if you've been a journalist for a long time. You're a teacher of journalist students. If you were an editor, what would you have done? Would you have republished those in the wake of the murders of the journalists in order to show solidarity?
I would not as an editor, and I feel strongly about that. But when I wear another hat as a journalism educator, I think all the reasons for republishing too. So to go back to what you said, it is a right to publish, certainly. But it is also thinking about what you achieve with publishing and republishing. So what is
the objective?
What is the objective, but what are the consequences of republishing? And those editors who did decide not to republish thought about that. There are other ways to introduce and to let readers know what the content is. As New York Times did, to describe that cover page, to explain what was that, why does it trigger such a huge discussion, what are the arguments on one side, to do all that without actually republishing. Going back to what you started with, there is a social responsibility of journalists. There is, whatever we do as journalists, we do have in mind public interest there. And from that big idea of public interest comes responsibility as well. When we talk about news, we talk about two sides of a coin. News is a business, obviously. It is outside of public service broadcasters. It is a commercial enterprise, but there is a public service component of a news business that makes it different from making shoes or bread. That is public interest, that is social responsibility. There are boundaries there, and they are ingrained in codes of conduct, in codes of ethics of journalism. We do have obligation to, the main claim that journalism makes is claim to truth. And we do report accurately, fairly, independently, all the big ideas that are, as I said, in code of ethics.
Melissa, you wanted to say something?
Now with all internet and social media, I think the question whether you could republish or not is becoming really irrelevant.
Yeah.
We have right now debate in Britain. Theresa May, our Interior Minister, suggested, as you know, all television content program should be vetted by Ofcom, which is the regulator, broadcast regulator, before aired for terrorist terrorism-related issues. So what is the point of vetting? And that's even what Margaret Thatcher didn't do.
With Sinn Féin.
With Sinn Féin.
There was a ban on having them on television or radio.
Just orally, but you can see them, but to vet and when we have a couple of hundreds of young women, so-called jihadi brides, who left Britain and joined, they're under 18, joined ISIS. So they didn't learn about ISIS through traditional legacy media. So if I don't see, and I didn't see Danish cartoons in British media, I saw them on internet because they didn't publish many of them. So it is how you publish, in which context, how you practice this, what we in MDI call responsible journalism. It's not only being fair, accurate, balanced. You have to add, in our view, two components more, and those two are how to be inclusive. So how to really include different views on what's happening and to do it in a sensitive way. So sensitivity and inclusion are important elements on this. So, and then you're in a kind of saved
Can we
area.
talk a little bit about self-censorship in this context? Because clearly when it comes to social responsibility to an audience, when you talk about public interest, or even a public service, the BBC regards it as a public service broadcaster, NPR in this country, the same. So there is there not an issue for journalists to consider every day about whether or not they are stopping themselves from saying something in order not to cross that line into incitement or hate speech or even something a lot less than that?
Absolutely. We did a special report on looking at Rwanda 10 years after the genocide and found unequivocally that there is a huge level of self-censorship. Similarly, and that's both because of the legal framework, but also just the broader social framework there. It's not, there are certain topics that are off limits officially, but also through just self-censorship. And the same thing in Egypt. I was there a couple of months ago, and having been there for almost a decade, going back and forth, such of self-censorship. I mean, you had a group of editors come out and essentially acquiesce to the government, saying, like, we all need to be on board with the government. We're not going to be critical. And thankfully, you had a group of journalists who signed on to a joint letter saying, no, we're not okay with this. So even within one kind of media ecosystem, you can have a lot of backlash against that. But I think that what we see is these sort of events do perpetuate self-censorship, especially in contexts where the laws are not well defined, where they're vaguely worded laws, where there are laws that that specifically forbid coverage of certain topics, but especially things like anti-state laws. So what you see now in the wake of Charlotte is this whole anti-extremism, countering violent extremism movement. And there was this big conference here that Obama convened, and among the attendees there were governments from Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, and these are governments that are imprisoning journalists on anti-state charges, on trumped-up charges, and this, of course, sends a broad signal to the rest of the media community, saying, lines, and then journalists are naturally going to self-censor, and because they don't know exactly where those are, and they don't want to test them. And it's really sad, in Egypt, where you really did have a lot of opening at the end of the first decade of the new millennium, and really pushing those boundaries. And now there's so much fear there about what the consequences will be, and we see that around the world. And that's why the past 3 years have had record numbers of journalists imprisoned.
Yeah, I mean, clearly there is a huge amount of fear in the countries some of the countries that you mentioned, but there is also a huge amount of courage. That when you in Bangladesh, for instance, in the last 6 months, 3, possibly 4 have been murdered in broad daylight, exactly the same way in which they've been stabbed by a group of people. The government and security forces have failed to find the murderers, even though it's fairly clear that there is a particular group that's targeting bloggers, and the bloggers are all secularism. And I think it would be useful to just unpack a little bit the sensitivities that we've been talking about, because clearly, whatever we think about the Charlie Hebdo case, the two men who murdered these journalists did so in the name of Islam. And I think that there is a space here in which I think we should at least explore to what extent the social responsibility that you're talking about then means that we have to be so sensitive that we err on the side of becoming a censored society where we won't say anything critical against Muslims because we fear the backlash. And that's certainly a debate that has been taking place in Europe in a big way.
Oh, absolutely. My background is in journalism too, and I come from the country where war started. It was state television where I worked, which introduced propaganda of the worst scale.
In the former Yugoslavia.
Former Yugoslavia, television Serbia. So as a journalist, I think we constantly questioning what we are doing and how to do it, and in a way we are at the board of, I think, out of sensitivity. If you are responsible, trying to do your job responsible, you are at the edge of self-censoring yourself, either because you know that you have an editor who is a bastard, and so you have to find a way, to do what you want in a way, or the owner of your media outlet, or your audience, which is sensitive to certain issues, and you are finding the way how to say something. So I'm more into how you say it. If I mention something like that, but like when you talk to your child, if you're an irresponsible mother, you would say, "You little idiot," you would never, there would be nothing out of you, when you get adult. But you find a way to say it in a way that you actually open the space for talking and getting a dialogue, and there is a decision coming out of it. I just want to go back to the bloggers and to media, because I think, Courtney, also Egypt, as we all know, social media are extremely popular and people are using it. What is for me shocking in Egypt, that people who fought for months at the Tahrir Square for democracy, for freedom of media, for freedom of expression, are now actually very much in favor of new President Sisi. And when you talk to them, you see it is because of their fears that Muslim Brotherhood, with their interpretation of Islam, would actually limit it much more the rights they're now struggling with Sisi. So this
And yet, there are still a lot of people who are out in that square for many, many weeks, are among the activists who are in jail.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's a very complicated picture in Egypt.
Very, very complicated. And probably there will be a time, more complicated, but our colleagues there are definitely giving up on practicing good journalism through the media, which are the legacy media, and which are prominent media. They're like on TV, television. The most prominent presenters and journalists on TV are out of job, waiting for some better times. That's why social media are important in countries such as Russia or such as Bangladesh.
The context in which we're talking, is it, when you look faiths, people from those faiths didn't attack the magazine. They just let it go. It's a satirical magazine. Is it Islam? And I think I'm saying it from a very particular perspective. I grew up in a Muslim family. I understand Islam. And I wonder about our acute sensitivity to saying anything critical because we're fearful. And of course, which cartoon would continue to draw the Prophet Muhammad post Charlie Hebdo?
Well, which Islam? When you say Islam, which Islam?
It doesn't.
Which
I mean,
interpretation?
Because
you
it
mean,
absolutely matters. And and this goes back to the whole coverage of the Charlie Hebdo thing. I mean, I can't remember how many times, Islam prohibits the portrayal of the Prophet Muhammad. Well, it really depends on your interpretation of the Quran and how many of those journalists actually went for themselves to the source, and that's why it does matter whether you publish, the pictures, whether people can see for themselves, this idea that when the journalists talked about what did, they only focused on the Muslim cartoons. They didn't mention the fact that it has this, whole tradition of criticism essentially any religion, any authority. And we actually heard, Mark hosted one of the journalists here, and we heard from her about their vehemently secularist approach. And I think that when we don't go to the original source, we can't blame Islam. I mean, what is that? Are we talking about the Quran? Are we talking about Sunni leaders, Shia leaders, something in between? Are we talking about observant? For me, this is a useless question to even ask, because there is no such. It's like saying, well, does Christianity support that? Well, who's Christianity?
I wonder whether it is a useless question, because there are many, many people would argue that if two men say they are doing something in the name of Islam, then it is incumbent upon the rest of us to at least examine why they're saying that.
I didn't hear journalists the bombings when you have white supremacist bombings. You
Sure.
don't hear that. Oh, is this a problem about Christianity? Should we really look at their extremist white supremacist views of Christianity? We don't hear that.
Yeah.
So part of it is the responsibility of journalists to
Sure.
use the same frame. But
I just want to say that those two who killed them were not Muslims, they were criminals. That's important to say, and that is important to report, because it is about framing the whole attack. If you say that there are two fundamentalists who did commit violence, whatever is the name, they are first and foremost criminals. And
Agreed, yeah.
I might actually have more faith in democracy than it might look so far. I think that I don't fear that increasing sensitivity and social responsibility will diminish critical role of the press at all. I don't think so, because in well-established democracies there is institutions and there are channels for public dialogue within which the critical discussion occurs. It is, and these journalists that we are talking about, whose auto-censorship might suddenly start working, are not people who jumped into journalism and are faced with the daily decision to publish or not. They went through the schools of journalism, they have their socialization within the newsroom, they have their experiences, they have their knowledge. They do have a whole setup for thinking about these issues. Does it work that way? Well, we all know that it doesn't completely work that way, but there are ways to improve, to help us all face new situations that arise by doing more in-house training, by running staff discussions. How do we cover these issues? What do we do in this situation? How it can be done better? What competitors did we could steal an idea and the model how to deal with that?
Go ahead.
No, just what it is. On one side, there is a need, obviously, for us journalists or for my colleagues who are still journalists to constantly new things. If we talk about Islam, many people have no idea what Islam is, or any other religion, because they are not religious or have.
Or they do, and it's completely wrong-headed,
or
yeah.
whatever. So if we talk about religion, so there is a need for really educating journalists, then what Courtney says, how many interpretations of Quran exist. And then on the other side, there is a need, obviously, for the audience to learn a couple of things, such, what is good journalism all about, or what is propaganda, what is not, and then also what are these other religions.
But it is the responsibility of journalists and editors, isn't it, to make sure that they're not only going to put on people on their airwaves and interview people in newspapers who represent an extreme view. In any case, the BBC is criticised about this frequently. The main flagship programme on the domestic network will very often have a man called Anjum Chowdhury, who is a member of, well, it's a banned organisation now, but he is an extremist. He's been associated with the two men who killed Lee Rigby in a street in Woolwich, murdered him with axes. So, and yet we put him on air. And we put Nick Griffin on, when he was the head of the BNP, again, an extremist right-wing white organisation. So it is a responsibility.
But there's the problem of fast
Go ahead.
of fast journalism as opposed to slow journalism. You just go for black and white, yes and no. I was invited by Al Jazeera a couple of years ago to some program, and only when I went there, it came out that I was there because I was Serb, and the other guest was Bosnian, and so we were supposed to disagree just because of our ethnicity. But actually, the two of us disagreed with the London, with the British lawyer. So it's like you are supposed to be pro and co. The range of what we call now, the 50 shade of gray exist in every society. And if you are practicing good journalism, then you are supposed to be inclusive in that way, to really bring people from different backgrounds to talk. Don't talk to pensioners only when your topic is pension. Don't talk to housewives only. But these people are citizens, they're taxpayers, they're voters, and should be included. But because of fast journalism, or what the Guardian's reader's editor said the other day, if I am waiting, to find all these, different backgrounds, or, go deep into slow journalism, all statistics show that within 2 hours of the event haven't happened, I've lost my audience if I haven't provided story development fast enough. So
go ahead.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think that's exactly the point. And it's slow, long. I think it's also lazy journalism. A lot of journalists will just look at, well, who was interviewed the last time? Who's in our file for this point of view? I worked in kind of development journalism for a bit, and one of the things we tried to do was get, more women's voices, because you have a choice. Like, do you to have, this person or this person as your expert? Are you going to go with just the big name? And the other thing is the people who get it wrong. There are, especially in this city, people who got the Iraq War extremely wrong, and now are still on TV talking about their opinions on Iran. And you're like, why is that guy still being asked to give his opinion when he was wrong? And I think that's a really critical responsibility of journalists, not to just create this polarized binary, black or white situation, because, even just the question, like, is this Islam or whatever, I live in a secular Muslim house, but you rarely hear secular Muslims in the media. It's usually the, hardcore extremists or the, anti, Muslim converts. So these two extremes. And then when we were in Istanbul recently with a group of Arab bloggers, and they were even more kind of extremist free speech than me and this other American girl. We're sitting there like, no, you don't have the right to yell fire in a crowded movie theater. And they're like, yes, you do have the right. You should have ultimate freedom of expression. I was like, where are they in this discussion? And I think that's, that is the responsibility of journalism.
So when you're teaching students, it is a big part of how journalism, does it have to be part of the construct and the course modules that you teach journalists that they must try and get a broad spectrum of of people represented in their stories, that when you're an editor, for instance, you know, if you're training to be a journalist, you're not going to be thinking immediately about becoming the editor of a national newspaper, unless you're hugely ambitious. Perhaps you are.
In this town, maybe.
So you start out as a journalist, a reporter on the beat, right? Is it something that you think isn't done enough, that we don't teach journalists enough, that they need to have a broader view of who is represented, whose voices are heard? And is it incumbent on media professionals, like the audience that we're sitting in front of, that they need to train journalists in developing countries to feel that they have the confidence to become spokespeople, but at least experts, people who have a diverse sensibility they bring to a story, as opposed to a Manichaean sensibility?
Absolutely. So it is inclusive journalism curriculum is a project that brought me to Media Diversity Institute, and I have been working on that for a long time now, having my own experiences in reporting diversity and what I was faced with as a journalist when doing that under the time pressure that we are talking about. It has to be a part of a curriculum, and it is part of a curriculum in a different way in different countries. I am running now one EU-funded project called Inclusive Journalism Reporting Europe and Asia Pacific, and 4 universities, 2 from New Zealand, 1 from Denmark and 1 from Finland, contribute in that project. And we have exchange of students and exchange of staff, and we have subjects teach students how to report from these regions and include diversity of voices there. We said that it is a responsibility of journalists to bring diversity of voices into public domain, and that's true. But there are parts of society that can help with that. And under the time pressure, of course, it takes 2 hours to find a woman who will be talking about the recent taxes in insurance company, for example. So, but there are that can help that, and civil society organizations, for example, can help with that by providing beat journalists with the list of contacts that can help when the issue arises, that are experts. When we talk about journalists, we talk about a delegated authority. We give authority to journalists to map reality for us, for the readers. That's what we do. We tell them, you are an expert in fast processing information, and you are going to tell me what has happened at the corner of the 11th Street and E, for example. So that's what we do with that general notion of being informed.
But then the person who's watching, the consumer of news, has a choice. They can choose to read a kind of liberal newspaper, or they can choose to watch Fox News. So, you know, they bring with them their own baggage, agenda, and whether that's been formed by years of having been brought up on a particular media, you know, not everybody sits around. This is what always amazes me. Editors, particularly in the BBC, assume that everybody is listening to everything, watching everything. And of course, then, you know, people's engagement with the media is much more fragmented. We know that, but they also have the choice. They can pick and choose.
Absolutely,
what they want.
but we should educate journalists knowing that they will go to all newsrooms. So hoping that wherever they are, they will do good journalism. So what we are talking about here, at the end, when we unpack all the issues, we are talking about good and bad journalism. Or ethical and unethical journalism.
I think there's also a role of journalists who kind of talk to other journalists who then talk to the broader public. So not every journalism outlet or journalist is trying to be like the BBC with a broad outlet. Like, I don't know if Dave Kaplan is still here. Oh yeah, he's walking back. Like, he has the Global Investigative Journalism Network. Like, a lot of the, you know, the stories coming out of that network, or some of these other, you know, public interests, investigative journalism, they're revealing also depending on other media outlets to amplify those. They're not necessarily trying to directly reach the public. And so it's, it is part of a broader ecosystem. I think that's also why we have to emphasize the importance of having a plurality of different media types so that they're not all driven by private advertising or state-run, have some nonprofit, have, public interests, trusts, whatever, a whole variety, so that media organizations and journalists can be driven by different imperatives.
And also, I suppose a lot of it is to do with, you talk about training journalists in a particular way. When I look at my experience at the BBC, and I've been there for more than 25 years, and when I first started, the I was in was an international newsroom, but it was still very, very white. And the television newsroom in the domestic part of the BBC is still very much the same, and that's 25 years later. And I think it is about empowering people to feel that they can be journalists as well, isn't it?
Yes.
That those people feel diffident and less confident than the mainstream educated people, that you can. It's possible if you're in a European city and you're not Caucasian, that actually journalism could be for you too.
That's why,
all three.
You tagged it.
Citizen journalism. That's why this is, we are in a different era than 25 years
Of
ago,
course.
where, you can start doing journalism. And I think, so many of the people I know from the Middle East, especially young women who really would have never really had access to the mainstream media, created, little mini media outlets on their Facebook pages or on their blogs and became sources and journalists in their own rights, experts on Western television, news anchors, etc. So, there is this whole new dynamic, I think, with, citizen journalism.
Just
and
an
the
avenue that makes it
ecosystem.
possible for them, that they don't have to feel that intimidated by the bigger organizations.
We ran together with Westminster University in London a master course. We developed it together and ran together diversity media. And what we are trying to do there, Westminster University is teaching theory-based modules. We are teaching practice-based modules to make clear to the journalists or future diplomats or future politicians or whatever, because not every journalism student ends in journalism, to understand which kind of societies of the world we are living in, because there is no such a society made of one ethnic group, one religious group, or whatever. So this multiculturalism, as we call it today, but actually there are different concepts or different ways of managing diversity in different societies. And that's where we are pushing our students towards to understand how it works in their societies. There was once upon a time melting pot concept in America, which is assimilation kind of model. That there is whatever cultural mosaic, Canadian model, which as far as I can see is quite popular in America. We have different models in Europe. Culturalism to ethnic assimilation, civic assimilation. These all concepts need to be questioned, not only by future students, but by the societies right now, because journalism does not exist outside of the societies we live in. And it seems to me, particularly after the economic crisis, that we stopped this. What are the issues in Europe? For a while we were talking about interculturalism, because we realized multiculturalism it was not working quite as we expected in the Netherlands.
Failed
and then
project.
Angela Merkel, then British Prime Minister, but then he complimented immigrants in Britain. We Brits are passively tolerant, whatever that means. But there is a need, obviously, for a debate, where we are standing and what should be the ways, and then media should be, journalism should be way, of a space to open the debate, and then, promoting that kind of debate, and journalism then reflects that kind of ways diversity is managed in each society.
Okay, let's open up questions to the floor. I think there are a couple of microphones around. Comment, or you can ask a question, and just tell us who you are if you think it's relevant. Lady in the front.
Hi, this is really fascinating. My name is Mindy Reiser. I went to the Columbia School of Journalism, a training post for journalists to be a PhD in social policy. And my question is this: what are we really talking about? You started to say that we, of course, have bloggers, we have people posting through listservs, through social media, and we have the legacy media. We have the Times and the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Guardian, whatever. But people don't necessarily go there. They may not even see them. So are they setting standards in terms of what should be put there and should not because of all the issues you've raised? And how relevant is that going forward? Will we always have the definitive, the establishment, the setting standards media, or is that day really vanishing? And if it is, then anything is the limit. I'll just finish by saying, I did some research for the Ford Foundation on a big project on sexuality, and I interviewed some of the major figures in that, and one man said to me, there's no longer pornography. He doesn't know what that means because anything can be shown, and what, verboten, forbidden, is no longer. So I'd like you to address that question because it's lurking there. What does this mean in terms of prohibiting, allowing, because everything is allowed somewhere?
Well, if you look at social media, there was a study a couple of years ago that showed 70% of the information shared on social media was originating from. So that it's part of the same ecosystem. So I don't think it's like social media is over here and then the news is over here. They're very much in conversation with each other. But I think there is a huge concern about the sustainability of the economic models upon which those legacy media, which typically have led the media organizations. But let's remember that the media ecosphere is beyond just Western, mainstream media. It includes, newspapers in Uganda and, TV outlets in, Dubai or whatever. So, I think we have to look at that within that context, and that there are other things like awards and professional recognition that help strengthen those norms. And that is one of the things about journalism, is that it is a profession, but it's not one that requires accreditation. So it really is this self-regulatory environment. And so I think it is important that for journalists who want to strengthen the profession and strengthen what journalism means versus forms of communication and expression, to strengthen those norms by practicing good journalism.
I don't think journalism is a profession. I think it's a trade, and it's a craft that you can learn.
For some people, it's a calling.
Mm-hmm. That's true, but I
think it's all of that. So it is craft, it is a profession, it is a cultural practice. I think that these legacy media are carrying cultural capital. So that's what they do. They are role models. They are then in social media.
The standard bearers,
they
if you like.
establish standards, and they are important. When we had an informal discussion last night about a whole set of issues that this topic includes, we said that it is easier to talk within the Western concept and within the Western context than to talk about what can be done in countries where democracy is unstable, that just came out of a conflict, that have that don't have press freedoms or press is partly freedom, really low standards of journalism. So what do you do there? Where do you start in this country? Where do you start from?
China's a classic example. When you think about the number of the thousands and thousands of people who are employed by the state in order to monitor and repress even social media, and to create algorithms which prevent particular words from used on Twitter, on Weibo.
Before teaching in New Zealand, I worked at Cardiff University and taught a course MA in International Journalism 87 students, half of them from China. So I learned a lot
very
about media
interesting.
in China
Yeah.
from them. And you have two groups of journalists, those who are on contract, who have higher salaries, who do have certain obligations, and you do have others who are on a contract. And you have vast majority of young who are very skillful with social media and who know how to cross the barrier and how to move from one platform to another if something is prohibited.
I mean, there is
Yeah.
so much. Just an example from last week when that the cruise ship that with 400 plus, nearly 500, they're between 50 and 80 years old. These were, senior people who were going on a cruise ship of a lifetime down the Yangtze River. And when that cruise ship sank, the Chinese state government so quickly prevented local journalists from even going there. It was impossible for them to even see the site. And then, of course, the pressure then goes on to social media, where people who just happen to be residents will start, going and talking to each other on social media. And that's how people build up a picture of what's going on.
So regardless how restrictive Chinese government is and has been, it seems that, and I'm going back to what several people mentioned, civil society and civil society organizations, which are gaining their voice in China too, and we can see that our partner in China, which is a university, is actually working with journalists through the NGOs. So on one side, empowering NGOs in how to communicate with the journalists. On the other, teaching them how to produce the content. And so, because it's quite difficult to work with journalists in China, so everyone is trying to find a way, and it's usually through the academia, NGOs, which have their journalists or journalists to the issues these NGOs are dealing with. So, and back to social media again, yes, we all can agree that the line between journalism, legacy journalism, and citizen journalism or social media is getting more and more blurred, and social media are imposing agenda too. In some societies, they're extremely important sources of information and disinformation, because very often we see that they come with something which only legacy media can then really check.
Although interesting that inside the BBC in the news department, which is the one I'm most familiar with, the idea that if you're working on a traditional newspaper in print media, that somehow your days are numbered, that future generations will not be able to say I work for a newspaper. It's really me, because obviously it's shifting, but I do sense very strongly that there inside the BBC that we still turn to the newspapers, and we'll still look at an article in the Daily Mail or the Guardian and say, oh, that's an interesting person, well, let's get them on. And so that is still a resource for the broadcast media.
I think it's the problem of us TV journalists. We would always think that newspapers are doing better jobs. But we are more famous. We are more famous because our faces are recognizable. So they envy us, but we know that they are better journalists. Something like that.
I'm
going to tweet that immediately to all my newspaper friends.
Somehow this idea that social media is inherently less professional or less accurate, that let's talk about not social media writ large, but citizen journalism on social media. I mean, look at Egypt. Look at the reporting on Tahrir Square right when the uprising started, and what was being shown on state broadcasters, which versus what was being reported on social media. So I think we really have to get away from this idea.
The snobbishness is so prevalent.
And
it's
I don't
awful.
think it's just snobbishness. I was in Libya. A person, we were sitting in the same room in front of computers when he jumped, and I don't speak any Arabic, but I can pick it. And he was like, Syria, Bashir, and I'm like, what, in English or whatever. And I can see he's very excited and very happy. I said, what? And I said, Bashir, kaput. And I said, Dad. And he ran out, obviously to share what he found on some website, through some social media. It came out, it was 3 years ago, so Bashir is still there. So he probably shared the information with minimum 5 people, those 5 with another 5. So it's what citizen journalists don't need to do, and what legacy journalists, particularly when we talk about responsible journalists, have to do is check, check, check. And that's what citizen journalists, look at...
It doesn't
Yeah,
matter
the
what
context.
it doesn't matter what the platform is. Content is king. So
And
what you were
checked.
saying, check accuracy, and an attempt at being impartial, and so on. All of those things are really, the kind of cornerstones.
Whether
of-
you're a citizen journalist or a professional journalist, because
Yeah.
a lot of these citizen journalists depend on their credibility and their reputation to continue being citizen journalists. But, to just, I think journalists did themselves a disservice when they said, the guy in Pakistan who tweeted that he heard, a plane flying overhead was somehow doing journalism.
Yeah.
2 hours
Because
before.
yeah, I
it
mean,
was
okay,
announced.
just making an observation, that used to be called a source, but now we're sometimes equating sources with journalism. But that's also journalists are giving away that idea that journalism is a specific type of expression. It's not any sort of expression. It's there's a certain set of principles that make it journalism.
Yeah.
No, I
Okay, so-
absolutely, yes, we do, it's good to have citizen journalists. We are running now what we call Dune Voices, which is a multimedia platform which covers 5 countries which share Sahara. All these young people who are producing this multimedia content and posting on Dune Voices are actually very young people. Some of them were actually just social activists or citizen journalists. So we are training them, pushing them, and probably within a year or two, we will drop the citizen and leave just the journalists. So right now we are still calling. So it is good they exist, but in their case, checking is not the must. And in case of journalism, responsible journalism, checking is the must.
So let's stay with young people, because someone has just tweeted
That's
a
why
question.
we are here.
Blair Glencorse, founder of Accountability Lab. How do we better engage young people in the media in ways that build a next generation with integrity? It's a rather broad question, but
Well,
since you're a teacher, let's start with
Can
you.
you say again?
no, I wanted as a young person to
Okay,
talk.
so how do we better engage young people in ways that build the next generation with integrity?
Well, through the educational system, obviously. How do we engage them when we make them the content relevant? When
I think the key word here is integrity. How do we engage them with knowing that actually the integrity is an absolute core value? journalism.
by building up a society where integrity matters. Yeah.
But what if you live in a society where integrity doesn't matter and
Well,
corruption is
then
rife?
you have a freedom of expression and you raise your voice and you ask for integrity in whatever is the work that is done, being a public institution or being in the individual, by bringing universal value of integrity at the pedestal, by going back to basic human values of justice, of solidarity, of integrity.
I think it's really challenging, because of course we can say that, but how do you do that? And again, I think Egypt is a very good example, because so many of those young people who really led that push for what you could say is about integrity, about having, those in power respond to the needs of the people, are now in jail. And they tried to raise their voices and then they got put in prison. So it's incredibly difficult. I mean, one thing is, US, EU, other world powers should think about that fact and think about the long term instead of just the short term myopic view of, say, national security and this idea that somehow, military relations with the state or, aid assistance, whatever, without putting it into a context. And I think also if we think about what we offer to young people, and not just assuming that young people don't want meaty content and don't care about the world. And, I think there has been recent polling on this in various different societies about how young people are engaged and they care about world issues and they, are global citizens, but also the very local. And so a lot of journalism, I would say in non-democratic countries and in developing countries, is very focused on the national political sphere. There's very little coverage of local issues, other non-political issues. And so I think that's another way, being, showing the range of issues that journalism can be about, that freedom of expression is about. It's not just about your right to criticize that person. That's part of it, but if we want to talk about integrity, it's about covering the range of issues that matter to young people and helping empower themselves and empower them as citizens.
And probably engage more young journalists to do that job, because how can you, if you don't have responsibility for your job? And the world is still on the shoulders of much older generations. So
we do have a prejudice towards young people. I mean, I notice it all the time. Lots of people of my generation are really dismissive of young people. And I find it extraordinary. I don't understand why we don't have more faith.
Well, I think those who are parents here can talk about,
I'm a parent.
I have a very young cousin. She just had the daughter, and my cousin is a vegetarian. And the baby, during the breastfeeding period, I asked the mother, going to be vegetarian. Right now she is, through the meal, eating harder food, and we then talked, so is she going to be vegetarian? So I heard like 3 days ago, the mother said, actually started giving her meat and I let her decide. Which is really nice, but and it's only food, which is very important thing. But what I find quite, challenging, that parents impose much more serious things to their kids, starting from the religion, the fact that you are vegetarian and religious. If you want to bring up a young person of integrity, then that person should decide herself, whether to be vegetarian, religious, or...
More questions? Oh, don't be so shy.
Have we given all answers, or we are boring?
Yes, there we are. Look, 2 hands have gone up. Excellent.
Hi, my name is Manning Kalish. I'm with an NGO based in DC and Brussels, and also a grad student. We talked about it a little bit in the last question and the panel today, and it comes to what has been presented as a dichotomy between slow and fast journalism. And is there any way to sort of bridge that and kind of use the fast journalism to kind of feed and build the interest to expand the attention cycle to really get at that slow journalism, so you really dig down and get deeper and more accurate stories? Thank you.
Shall we? Go ahead. For current affairs, but if you want to be into terminology, so now we are talking about slow journalism, and I don't see the difference between what we used to call news department and current affairs department. So we need both. So you have to rush to get the news, you check it as much as you can, but then you do follow up, how it happened. So.
And there are new services that are specifically helping to get typically, disenfranchised or non-majority voices out there. And I unfortunately can't remember one of them, but there is one, I think, specifically.
Media Diversity Institute.
Well, of course, yes. And then there are but for experts on, specific issues where they try to get, women and minority voices. There's Foreign Policy Interrupted, which just started recently, which tries to highlight, foreign policy analysis and articles by women. So, there, and of course, with the internet, these are now at the hands of reporters, but, they just need to take a few minutes to figure out what are those resources so that they're on hand during that breaking story.
And there was another hand that went up there. Have you got the microphone, sir?
Me, I'm a visiting fellow here, and a very useful and engaging discussion. But I was wondering if I could make sense of some of the arguments that some lines of expression, because 2 of the panelists said that they would have not republished the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, and the question is really, how many how many views can journalists or papers pander to? I mean, if there are Muslim extremists, there are other forms of extremists, and the line is going to continue. Because I mean, I'm myself a victim of Islamic extremists. That's why I'm here. I had to flee the country last year.
Do you want to
And-
just tell us what happened to you?
well, what happened to me? I was on TV. Show host, and so somebody tried to kill me. I mean, the Taliban tried to kill me, and so my companion who was with me, he died on the spot, and I had to leave the country. So my question really is that freedom of expression does not really have if you set limits, who draws those limits? Because if you start saying that we need to be responsible, but then many countries would think that responsibility is following the in authoritarian regimes, public interest is equated with that of the military or the state repression. So in China, if you speak against the Chinese government, that's being anti-China. In Russia, you criticize Putin, you being anti-national, you being a traitor. So I think we need to really have, I'm myself not clear on that, but I would like to ask you, are there really, I mean, who sets the limits on freedom of expression? And, if it is context specific, and if your context is authoritarian or religious or fundamentalist, then you're actually pandering into some of the things that journalism exposes or
I think that's.
Michelle, do you want to decide who to talk? Because all three of us are very talkative.
Well, I mean, I think that's a great point, and it's lovely to see you, Raza. Who decides what's responsible? And I couldn't agree with you more that in, authoritarian contexts or non-democratic or, majority religious contexts, it's too often, those in power, and whatever is dissent or criticism is considered irresponsible. And I think, something else we didn't touch on, but which is incredibly relevant in Pakistan as well as other countries, can have the opposite intended impact, which is to encourage more violence or,
It's definitely the case in Pakistan.
yeah.
I mean, you cannot just have one rule, and that's when I studied journalism, I gave a definition, so fair, accurate, balanced, inclusive, and sensitive. So the governments might interpret the term in different ways. As a journalist, I think you have to decide on daily basis, what to do with material. And one thing is, if someone totally unknown in a society says something using some not very popular means to spread the message. So this is one of the criteria how to define what is hate speech and what to do with the hate speech. Who said it, the intention, the means used. So it's something you have to decide on daily basis, not to put on the wall. And this is this is how you are going to deal. But we are also going back a bit to censorship. One thing is what you deal with the certain events and speech in peaceful time, democratic societies, and the other time of conflicts and wars. So we have right now in Europe the issue of Russian propaganda and what Russia has been doing in Ukraine. So there are 3 new studies recently presented in Riga at Media Forum on in Russian language media. But so how do you respond to that? Do you respond with another propaganda, with responsible journalism, and then do you censor yourself at the time of conflicts? That's the issue we had in former Yugoslavia during the war. If you censor yourself, and then the gossip goes, rumor goes around, is it worth then really providing information, but carefully really packaged, if I may use the expression. So there is no one forever rule, but the governments will always use your democratic or undemocratic.
What might be interesting is a story from Denmark after publishing Mohammed cartoons, Jyllands-Posten. Journalism profession was in a turmoil. So what can we do? What is happening here? is there any way to do it differently? And many changes have been done so far. So they introduced in majority of mainstream media so-called integration reporter, in charge with reporting on ethnicity, religion, immigration. There was a new association of ethnic minority journalists was formed. And one of the things, and I am saying this based on a study that I'm reporting ethnicity and religion in 9 European countries. Denmark was one of them. So they formed that association of ethnic minority journalists, and people from there, knowing that the newsroom diversity as well, went to high schools and gave talks about journalism and encouraged went to community high schools and encouraged young people from ethnic minorities to study journalism. So did the whole promotion there. What the examples of good reporting on ethnicity, religion, including revival of undercover reporting, and I know that it's a no zone, but in Europe it is practiced, because what they found was that they were disconnected from that part of social reality. They didn't grasp the depth of these stories of people who came to Denmark to start a new life. So some of them undertook undercover reporting to see what they experienced. And one of the examples that majority of people we interviewed in Denmark gave was ethnic minority journalist working for a main daily broadsheet newspaper, who went with 3 of his mates from the same ethnic group to a couple of nightclubs in Copenhagen and was not allowed to enter any of them, and wrote a story about that later.
If there are no more questions, are there more questions? Anyone? One more. Excellent. I think we've got just time to squeeze that in.
My name is Leonarda, and I'm from Voice of America Indonesia section. Yes, I have a question. I'm very happy that you were talking about the responsibility of journalists, that fair, accurate, balanced, and inclusive. In my opinion, as it's a good point, but as an employee that we work for media, what should we do? Especially in Indonesia, we have a lot of private media behind us. Every media has like an agenda in political, in every aspect, in economic. What can we do to keep objective as a young journalist? Thank you.
Well, as someone who comes from similar background, because there was a point in Indonesian history where I come from, Yugoslavia, Indonesia were very close, so some kind of socialism. You have different options, from serving the way the owner of your media outlet wants you to do, or possibility, as many of us have chosen, to lose your job, but to fight for, well, I'm sorry, that's an option too. We had to fight heavily against propaganda on television where I was working, and I was just one of 1,300 people who were fired for doing that. So there are people in Indonesia, such as one of great professors of journalism, Professor Ade Armando in Indonesia, who's been promoting inclusive journalism and reporting diversity. And when there was a conflict in Makassar, and it was an inter-ethnic conflict, and your colleagues, journalists in that part of Indonesia, were actually almost like in the wars in Yugoslavia, enjoying showing the other side as the evildoers, showing the heads cut off and well, you have to decide. You are an individual, and sometimes it does cost you a job. It does cost you being beaten by the police, arrested, or whatever. But if journalism is not only your job, but your calling, then you've chosen a fantastic profession or job or calling, which you have to be prepared to risk things. But I
It goes
also
back to talking about in terms of integrity. You know, you have a choice to have integrity or not.
Exactly. I mean, similar situation to Melissa, choosing, I worked for Al Arabi and ended up losing my job over an article that I chose to publish. And I think that as a young journalist, it's almost easier to do that because maybe you don't have the same, I don't know, financial or familial commitments that an older journalist does. So actually standing by your ground and standing up for that integrity can open doors to a career that maybe you never even knew was possible.
and solidarity. That's something what we were missing a lot when we were going through what you might have been going through. Solidarity from your colleagues, from other media. Usually television journalists are under the hardest pressure because of the power of television. So solidarity between, these journalist associations and international big media organizations with local independent media. Because it's one thing if CNN or BBC journalist comes to a conflict zone and try to do good journalism. And the other is if an independent local media outlet tries to do that. And I'm sure that remember some examples of some independent radio stations in the Balkans not being liked, not being liked actually by the other side because you were still from the side of the enemy. So the solidarity of big international media organizations with local media outlets trying to do good journalism is very important. But unfortunately, big international media organizations very often use the local journalists as their stringers, even giving them any kind of insurance.
Happens all the time.
Or when, and the worst comes to the worst, they just pull out and the locals are left there. So solidarity, I think, is very important.
That is a very, very good note on which to end, because in a way, everything that we've been talking about is to do with being proud of being a journalist and seeing it as a very important job in society and in contributing to civil society. I'm going to just close by saying thank you all very much for being such a great audience, for being so attentive and polite and engaging with us, and also just fantastic panelists. Thank you all so much. It's been my huge pleasure to hear you.
Well done, Razia. Thank you.